This is episode number 149 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Peter Butt. Peter is an author and award-winning documentary filmmaker. He is the founder of Blackwattle Films, and his work has appeared on BBC, National Geographic, the History Channel, and elsewhere. Peter has focused particularly on the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and espionage activities, particularly in Australia. I invited Peter onto the podcast to discuss his work investigating Frank Nugan and Michael Jon Hand, founders of the Nugan Hand Bank. Their small financial institution quickly grew and opened branches all over Asia and Australia and financed drug smugglers, arms traffickers, and clandestine intelligence operations. But it all came to a head in 1980 with law enforcement investigations, the death of one of the founders, and the disappearance of the other. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered if you have what it takes to perform a covert operation yourself? A long infill or exfil on foot with a pack on your back and your life on the line? If so, there's one way you can find out. SOE Expeditions is now offering guided expeditions that recreate some of the most arduous missions of World War II. This is not an afternoon walking tour. This is a multi-day foot patrol through rough terrain, keeping to a timetable just like the men who came before you did. You will put yourself in their shoes and find out exactly what you're made of. This is not for the faint of heart or the out of shape. Coming in March 2025 in Norway is a trek along the route of Operation Ripe on the 80th anniversary of the only sabotage mission by the American OSS to take place in Norway. All expedition participants will be equipped with a Talus cold weather jacket made by Kila at no additional charge. Are you tough enough to follow in the footsteps of the Special Operations Executive? Find out more at soeexpeditions.com or click the link in the show notes of this episode. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. This really is an incredible story, and I'm so glad for a chance to discuss it finally. It's kind of amazing to me how Nugan Hand was connected to so many pivotal figures and incidents around the world during the 1970s and 1980s. A lot of familiar names were popping up and familiar operations, familiar locales from my previous episodes and my previous research. So I want to ask you, what is it that led you to investigate this story in the first place?
Well, I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and the story was on the front page of the newspapers virtually weekly and towards the end of the bank's history daily.
Okay, yeah, major scandal there, but it's one that, quite frankly, it took me quite a while to kind of find it, and not directly researching it, but it came up organically, but it was a long time after I started this project. So that, in my mind, at least tells me that it's not very well known or not very well documented here in the United States, much more so in Australia and Southeast Asia, I take it.
Yeah, that's right. It did come to the media in America when the Nugan Hand Bank collapsed. And it was then the subject of a book called Crimes of the Patriots, which made a big splash in about 1982, 1983. It's probably then gone from the memory of most people.
Yeah. I've come across a lot of stories like that, and I love to bring them up to a kind of a new generation or even people that haven't thought of them in 30, 40 years, that sort of thing. That's one of the great things about this project that I've taken on. And I know that you've probably wowed quite a few people through your own podcast and through your own research and publications to date.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, there's a new audience for it now. We sold quite a number of books when I found Michael Jon Hand's New Identity. It was front page news in the newspaper here. It made Newsweek in America, and it was also reported widely across Asia, where Nugan Hand Bank was basically operating most of the period of its operation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not to skip too far ahead, but there is quite a payoff to this story, quite an epilogue as it is, and you were very central to that part. So I'm looking forward to talking about that in a few minutes. But let's go back to the beginning then, Peter. So can you tell me who exactly was Michael Jon Hand and what was his background before he started the Nugan Hand Bank?
Well, Mike Hand was born in the Bronx to a working class family. He set out to become a park ranger of all things. But at the outset of the Vietnam War, he signed up for the military and was quickly assigned to Special Forces, the Green Berets.
Okay, so this was during the Vietnam War then, I take it. Had that already begun once he entered the Army?
Yes, that's right. And he found himself in one of the first major battles of the Vietnam War at Dong Xoai. This was a town that was overrun by the Viet Cong. The battle lasted a few days and nights, and things got pretty desperate when they all ran out of ammunition. So Hand played a major part in survival of not only himself, but also of his commander, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for
Oh, wow.
saving his commander.
Okay, yeah, that's a extremely prestigious combat award there. And I understand that after they ran out of ammo, he had kind of a shocking role to play. He had to fight just with his knife at that point, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
That's right. He fought off a number of the enemy with his K-bar knife. One of the enemy came at him and he used his K-bar knife to actually rip up through his sternum, and then he ripped the man's head off with his hands.
Oh my gosh. My gosh.
It was
That was worse than I thought, honestly.
it's a very hard thing to imagine, isn't it?
Yeah. I have not personally done anything like that, and I don't think I know anyone that has either. But like you said, it was very, very desperate time, and it's kind of hard to put myself in those shoes, honestly, facing death like that. But it certainly certainly left a remark on his life in some ways, I guess you could say, since he
That's
won
right.
the award.
Yes, the award, not everybody gets the Distinguished Service Cross. Some believe he should have been decorated even higher, but he got that. And I think that made his career, in a sense. He was able to open doors.
Right. And one of those doors, as I understand it, led him to, well, I guess I should ask you, did it lead him to leaving the military, or was it just a special assignment while he was still serving as a Green Beret?
Well, he ended up being picked up by the CIA, which gave him further training, dispatched him to Laos for a top secret mission dubbed Project 404. In fact, the CIA's mission was unknown to the American public at the time, and he was assigned to train Hmong tribesmen in counterinsurgency, basically to oppose the North Vietnamese-backed Laotian communists.
Hmm.
That also added to his cachet. Wherever he went in military circles, he was able to tell them about his service, and in later in business, that really impacted upon his cachet.
Okay, I see. Yeah, his reputation certainly preceded him at that point, no question about it. So, did he leave the army fairly quickly after he finished his service in Vietnam, or did he have like a whole career in the military?
No, he left it pretty quickly. I think he was quite damaged physically
Mm,
by the experience. So he looked at various options. What am I going to do with my life? He said. For some reason, he ended up in Sydney, Australia. We don't know exactly why he chose it, but it may have been word of mouth from other servicemen who came to Sydney on R&R. In
mm,
fact, the US military chose Australia and chose Sydney because it was on the doorstep of Asia during the Vietnam War, which was ongoing for a number of years.
sure.
And he got involved in selling real estate. Some Americans that he made contact with were selling real estate north of Sydney, about 6 hours flight. He was taking servicemen on R&R up to that land, and he was selling that real estate, making a very good profit, by the way.
Hmm.
He was making about 25% of every sale. So he basically fell on his feet, but he was a long way from home.
Hmm.
He was in Australia, which few Americans really knew about.
Yeah, I can imagine lots of people don't really get outside of the major cities if they make it there at all. And just I have to be imagining that he had a tremendously sort of captive audience there with these soldiers on R&R. They're seeing a brand new, beautiful, peaceful country. They're probably flush with cash since they couldn't spend very much in Vietnam, and they're trying to think about what they might do if they actually survive the remainder of their tour. So they're kind of speculating in real estate, and he is earning 25% on every sale, like you mentioned. So I can see how that would have been a booming business for him at that time. Is that how he wound up working with Frank Nugan, or did they meet some other way?
Well, they met through contacts. Michael Hand gravitated to King's Cross. King's Cross is basically the red light district of Sydney. It was the hub of US military people. They would all go there. And Frank Nugan, who was a young lawyer who was disgruntled with being a lawyer, was living in that district. In fact, probably about 200 meters from a bar that everybody was going to. And Michael Hand was virtually living in on his own time off. And so they met there and basically became friends.
Hmm. Okay, I see. So that is unusual. This American newcomer there and this disgruntled lawyer, did they just decide to go into business together and start something brand new, like talking at the bar over drinks, or did they try some other things before they settled on what would become the Nugan Hand Bank?
Well, look, it's hard to know. That's the mystery.
Hmm.
Why did they decide to do it? But both were ambitious, extremely ambitious. Sydney was a place where there was lots of money flowing. So they rented offices in the most prestigious street in Sydney, a few doors up from the Sydney Opera House, and started this merchant bank. It was an incredible start. You know, they had no idea how to run a merchant bank. They had no customers. They just put up a banner, on the
Hmm.
on the door and used their skills. Michael's skills, he was very affable, and Frank was a hard salesman. They would knock on doors. They even went to councils, the local councils, and said, "Invest in us, and we'll give you 2% more than the market." They attracted people from all across Sydney, all across Australia.
Wow. That's amazing because they have nothing to back it up with at that point. From what I understand, they have no financial experience. Basically, was this truly just like force of personality kind of opening doors, you think? Or did they have some other sort of hook that they were able to use to get so many customers so quickly?
I think the hook was just their personalities
Hmm.
and their determination. Obviously, it was at a time when Australia was opening up to the rest of the world and money was flowing. And I think, there was a certain sense of greed
Hmm.
evolving in the Australian consciousness, particularly in the business world. They were able to even go to the regular banks and say to them, "This is what we're doing. We aren't in competition with you. We're going to offer services that you guys can't offer. We're going to be able to move money internationally. You can't do that without going through all different types of regulatory doors. We will be opening that up to our customers. We're not going to be in competition with you." And the customers just fled to that. They heard about this and they were also advertising in newspapers. So that sort of worked in their
Hmm.
favor as well.
Okay. So were they right off the bat? Were they attracting like criminal enterprises and that sort of thing, or was there a lot of legitimate business and small businesses that sort of thing that were gravitating towards them?
Initially, it was just the small investors. They were knocking on doors of, doctors, wealthy doctors. It wasn't the criminal element that they were looking for
Hmm.
initially.
Okay.
That evolved.
Okay, yeah, I see. That was a big question of mine because when you're starting something brand new and you don't know what you're doing, like what's your business plan? Like where are you even going with this? And it would make sense to me if they were like, hey, why don't we just, offer services to people that we know can't get legitimate banking services elsewhere? But apparently even that was not what they were doing. So I'm very surprised.
Not initially, but obviously they saw avenues for that. Initially, they opened their one branch, but within 15 months, they opened a branch in Hong Kong. And they located that in the red light district, which
Hmm.
probably suggests that that was the case, that they were looking at different types of customers. In fact, their customers included various triad gangs who were money laundering. So that was where I guess they realized that that was where their future may lay.
Sure. Yes, certainly. I can understand the draw of something like that, an untapped market that's very, very cash intensive and maybe not the kind of people that you would normally want to do business with. But as we mentioned already, Michael Hand was a pretty tough dude. He was not a pushover by any means, I can imagine. So was it within like 15 months, you think, that they realized that the market was their offerings were geared more towards criminal enterprises? Like, did they do a major pivot at that point and go directly to the triads and other groups like them?
Yes, I think the word got around in Hong Kong. And once they saw the profits that could be made, here you might be making 2% on the money, on the turnover. There they were charging 15% to the triads. So
Oh,
if
wow.
if that's your options, anyone in that sort of business is going to look for that kind of profit.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, no question about it. Besides the triads, did they have any other major customers early on, major criminal customers early on? Was there other organized crime organizations in that area at the time that they were working with?
No, it occurred probably about 3 years into the
Hmm.
operation. Frank Nugan started offering the transfer of money overseas without going through the legal channels, such as the tax office and the Reserve Bank. That idea came to them through a drug trafficker who basically turned up and said, "I want to be able to deposit $200,000 in Sydney and then go to Hong Kong and pick it up next week." And Frank said, "Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. We have to go through the tax office, the Reserve Bank, and other channels before we can do it." The drug trafficker basically said to him, well, come on, Frank, if you want to be in business, our business is going to make you a lot of money. You've got to come up with a way. And Frank then realized very quickly that there was a way to do it. And it was pretty simple. And today it sounds ridiculous, but because you couldn't do it in those days, it did have a bit of risk involved. And basically what it was you come and deliver your $200,000 here and go to Hong Kong and pick it up next week. But the money doesn't travel across the ocean to Hong Kong. Basically, they take it out of deposits there. That was totally illegal to do. They weren't transferring the money. They were just taking it out of depositors' money. Now that was all fine as long as there was the money there in both bank accounts in Nugan Hand, Sydney, and Nugan Hand, Hong Kong. But if there wasn't enough, then you got into trouble. And then the authorities would come knocking on your door and saying, well, what's going on here? They worked this system out. And once the word got around between drug traffickers, they were all knocking on the door. And, within a few years, they had 25 drug traffickers on the books.
Oh, wow. Wow, okay.
And these were major international drug traffickers. They weren't just Australian. In fact, it became the template for drug traffickers around the world, how to move money. And the Mr. Asia Syndicate, which had arms across Asia and into Europe and United Kingdom, was one of the first international drug traffickers. They started in Australia and New Zealand. They moved to Hong Kong. Then they moved into Europe.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that scheme that you mentioned is astonishingly simple, and it's so simple that I don't understand how it doesn't set off some sort of alarm. I guess that there were not regular audits or inspections or anything along those lines in any of the places that they were operating. Like, as long as a customer doesn't complain somewhere, they are basically in the clear. Is that about right?
Yep, drug traffickers don't usually go and complain to the Reserve Bank.
Right. Yeah, I guess if any of their normal, legitimate small business people can't make a withdrawal one day, I can understand how upsetting that would be. But then they would, call a hotline rather than have both of those guys killed, I suppose.
Yes, that's right.
So I know that eventually, I believe in 1975 or so, Michael ended up going to Africa. So was he intending to open more branches, like spread even farther across the globe, or was this something totally different?
It was totally different. In fact, Mike went to Frank and said, I'm resigning and I want my name taken off all the bank records. Oh, wow. Frank was a bit taken aback by this. Mike told him he was going turkey farming. And that's what Frank told the staff, who were all in shock because they were only basically in operation for 2 years.
Okay.
Here's one of the names on the bank's register. A major shareholder in the bank disappears. But in fact, Michael had been recruited by the CIA to acquire weapons for its top secret war in Angola. And so that's why he went there in sort of incognito. This turkey farming was just a ruse.
Wow.
In a sense.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So that's another massive pivot. Do you have any idea what it was that made him a good fit for a entirely different kind of business on a totally different continent? Was he just like considered a consummate salesman or a consummate can-do kind of guy, something like that? I mean, I'm surprised that they would pick him for something vastly different than what he had done for them in the past.
Well, the fact that he had worked with the CIA in Laos, had been trained by them, meant he had plenty of connections.
Okay, yeah.
And the CIA had this secret war going on. Even the US government didn't know about it. The president didn't even know about it. The CIA was out there. It was actually advertising in one of the Special Forces newspapers for mercenaries. Michael must have heard about this, and somebody suggested Michael. He went over there basically to join this group of 80 former CIA operatives, and they were actually training and supplying weapons to one of the groups who were fighting against the communists in Angola.
Okay, I see. They must have made him an incredible offer if he's leaving behind this burgeoning high-profit business in Sydney to go to Africa. Did they have any sort of leverage over him or anything like that? Or did he just kind of relish that opportunity, do you think?
I think he relished that opportunity. He was, experienced in both weapons and in training. The area that he wasn't so good at was actually the acquiring of of the weapons and also an aircraft. He tried to get those from Australia. He failed. We don't know where he got them in the end, but they were obviously supplied with weapons over there, and they were there for 12 months. He was there for 12 months with the CIA. And then, as they say, the shit hit the fan when the US government heard about the CIA's mission in Southern Africa, and they shut it down. There was an inquiry, there was a major investigation into the CIA's activities, and the President Ford sacked the chief of the CIA, William Colby, over this. And Michael Hand returned to Australia and rejoined the bank.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he had his time over there. Was he, I'm trying to get a sense of the scale of this. Like, was he trying to acquire a few thousand rifles, or was he trying to get, you mentioned aircraft. So, I mean, this is like outfitting a major, combined arms force, like, multiple shiploads or, $10 million worth of equipment. I mean, what kind of scale was he dealing with while he was there in Angola?
Well, we don't know that. We know what he was looking for here. He was looking for handguns, particularly, and rifles, ammunition, and he was looking for an aeroplane to actually fly it from Australia
Okay.
over to Africa. That was it. And some of the files were found at weapons suppliers in Sydney. They'd kept the records of Michael Hand's, or Frank Nugan was actually asked to actually help supply these weapons as well. Nugan sent one of his staff over to travel with Mike Hand into Angola. And so we know that this was a legitimate CIA connection, that Michael Hand was there working with the CIA. It wasn't this freelancer who thought he was with a big head. Michael Hand was he was obviously a former CIA operative, military operative. He was very valuable to them.
I see. Okay. So you mentioned both of these guys are involved in this deal to one extent or another, but was the bank itself, the organization, were they as well involved with CIA in this or in anything else around that same time period? Or is it just the two founders kind of branching out a little bit?
Well, yeah, it was more Mike Hand's thing to do this. Frank went along with it because he wanted Mike back in the bank, obviously. He did what he could, and sending his staff across there is evidence of that. But later on, the bank becomes involved with the CIA, and that's another story.
Okay. Yeah, I'm certainly ready for that. So this was a totally separate thing once they actually got involved with one or more intelligence agencies, and it was separate from the Angola venture?
Yes, Mike basically returned to Australia and began recruiting CIA and military officers to run the international branches. And they set up all across Asia, into Europe, into the Americas as well. They had admirals, they had generals, they had former CIA economics officers, people who were involved in the finance side of the CIA. And even William Colby, the former head of the CIA, became the bank's legal advisor. The bank basically told his managers that the Nugan Hand Bank had become the paymaster for the CIA around the world in 1977. He called them together in Hong Kong, where he was now based, and said, here we are, we're now dealing with the CIA as a customer.
Wow. Was that like an idle boast on his part, or did the bank genuinely take over an enormous amount of transactions, across that hemisphere, essentially for CIA?
Well, people who specialize in this side of CIA's operations, not only former CIA officers, but journalists and others, confirm that this is the way the CIA worked. A lot of its operations didn't have government approval, and it needed to be able to move money. It needed to be able to pay civilians, former military officers from different countries to come and do operations for them, and also to bolster. Money was a very powerful thing in that period of the Cold War. Money was used by governments to buy favor in certain countries. And there were a number of situations. There was how many? 60 odd coups d'etats, and many of them were around the world in the 70s, 60s and 70s and early 80s. And the CIA was involved in a lot of them. And some situations, they had the people who they were trying to help, such as the Shah of Iran and the Marcoses in the Philippines, had to have ways out of their country should things go bad. And in the Shah's case, the Shah of Iran was forced out of his own country. And who did he need to move his money? Was the CIA, and the CIA put him in touch with Nugan Hand and other bankers around the world. The legitimate bankers, say the Swiss bankers, didn't want anything to do with it, but Frank Nugan and Michael Hand saw this as an opportunity. In this case, with the Shah of Iran's money, Frank Nugan started to get very worried when it was on the front page of the newspaper. So he was actually on the front page of the newspaper himself. So Michael Hand went and did it by himself, and he reaped millions and millions and millions of dollars for that.
Oh, man, I can imagine. Okay. So once they started doing this kind of work, was it different only in a matter of scale from what they were previously doing? Was it still essentially the idea that we want to deposit 200,000 in Sydney and withdraw 200,000 in Hong Kong, only on a much grander scale, or were they offering totally new services to CIA and their affiliates as well?
Look, the amount of money moved for the CIA, we have no idea of. But for individuals, we're now talking in millions and millions of dollars.
Sure. Okay, I see. Yeah, it sounds like this was a ready-made, like a turnkey kind of business almost, with the branches they had spread throughout and their staff. I assume at that time they've got like this institutional experience in, moving money quickly, not asking a lot of questions, not keeping a lot of documentation. So it sounds like a great thing for CIA to jump right in, or any intelligence organization to jump right in. It's very understandable that they want to move money around without it being noticed by anyone. So
exactly.
I'm still amazed, by the way. I've forgotten already. What year did they actually found the bank, just the two of them together? Was it 72?
73.
73. Okay. And I think you said in 77 is when Colby joined the board, along with a bunch of other guys?
He joined it in around about late 78.
78. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. So, but roughly 5 years for these guys to go from two guys meeting each other, having an idea, and opening an empty office with no clients. And 5 years later, the former director of the CIA is on their board, and they've taken over operations and global operations, really, for the world's largest, best funded intelligence organization. That's a really incredible rise to the top for these guys. I have to imagine that they couldn't have foreseen this just a few years earlier.
No, that's right. And being a paymaster for the CIA was not something you would actually put on your resume. This was top secret stuff. It only came out via one of the executives who was at the meeting where Michael Hand announced this, and this was in Hong Kong. He was the branch manager of the Chiang Mai office, which was dealing with the heroin traffickers. And basically, he was outed. He had to get protection. He basically turned to avoid prosecution. He gave the investigators who turned up information about Nugan Hand's operations, including the fact that he was invited to this meeting when he heard from Michael Hand that they became the paymaster for the CIA.
I see. Was that the point then that things started to fall apart? Because, like I said, these guys have had an incredible rise to the top, but we know this story does not have a happy ending for either of them. So was it this particular incident, or were other things happening as well that would sort of collapse Nugan Hand?
Around the same time as this occurred, the CIA deal, Frank Nugan was getting into trouble in Australia. He was a director of the family fruit transport business, which had grown to be the biggest in Australia. Rumours had started to pass around and end up in the newspapers that the company was transporting marijuana and dealing with drug traffickers. So the government set up a corporate affairs investigation to investigate. And at the same time, the police were looking into the Nugan Hand bank's dealings in Australia with drug traffickers. They learned that the bank had set up the branch in Chiang Mai and was moving money for heroin traders. So that's when the eyes of the authorities was homing in on Nugan Hand Australia. And Frank Nugan started to go completely off the rails. He panicked. He was doing weird things like getting rid of the family company auditors, which actually drew more attention to the bank, to his other operations. So he and his brother were actually arrested, and that was front page of the newspaper. And Nugan Hand Bank, there was a run on the bank in Sydney. People were turning up and saying, "We want our money out of this bank. You guys are crooks." So Michael was becoming this global paymaster, and Frank Nugan was becoming a liability in Australia.
Okay, I see. Yeah, it sounds like he was compounding his problems then if he's trying to get rid of the auditors and having a Does it sound like, was it like a slow motion mental breakdown of his or something like that, or just business concerns spiraled out of control?
Both. He was personally spiraling out of control, and the business was becoming quite toxic in
Hmm.
a sense in Australia. Fortunately, the international side of the bank was expanding very quickly, and news didn't travel like it does today. A problem in Australia, a little country, small population, who cares what happens down there? They weren't hearing about Frank Nugan's problems in Australia.
Hmm.
They had their own salesmen around the world. They had an admiral, they had a general, they had CIA operatives who were doing the selling. This was big international business, and what was happening in Australia was of little concern to the rest of the world.
I see. I see. But I guess it was not of little concern to Frank. So did he end up? He was arrested, as you said, for the family business problems. But was he also ultimately arrested for Nugan Hand's activities, or was that like a totally separate thing from that particular investigation?
Different thing. There were royal commissions going on. Royal commissions, like the biggest investigation you can get in Australia and in Britain as well. They were looking into drug trafficking, and the name Nugan Hand kept coming up. And also, there was another separate drugs investigation into the bank, and they had an undercover drug officer who was working in the red light district and also in Chinatown in Sydney. He decided he was going to try and infiltrate the Nugan Hand Bank. He got information from a former person who worked, a Chinese person who worked with the bank, who was a heroin trafficker. He got information that Nugan was doing this, and he tried to infiltrate the bank. Well, Frank Nugan turned up at the offices of the drug investigation and said, we're legitimate bankers. Why are you investigating us? And basically, he got away with it. They shut down the investigation into Nugan Hand. But there,
Wow.
but that's the gall of the man. He was a fighter. He was willing to take them on, and he convinced them to shut that down. But still, there were other drug traffickers that were spilling the beans to other investigations. He didn't know about this so much until it came to a head, probably in around about just in 79. He started to realize that things were going very bad. He and his brother were likely to go to jail for a good deal of time, maybe a couple of years for their other family operation. So things weren't looking good for Frank.
I see. Yeah, I know that this story has a sad ending, which we'll get to, but I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting over the idea that if you're under criminal investigation, all you have to do is ask why you're being investigated, and then they'll stop. So hopefully, no other criminal organizations figure that out in the future. That's. I was not expecting that at all, honestly, Peter. You just ask what's going on, and say, "No, I swear I'm legitimate," and they'll say, "All right, well, we believe you." I know it's not that simple, but I'm amazed by this,
Mm.
honestly.
Yes, it is. I guess if it's undercover and you've outed the undercover
Yeah,
operation,
yeah,
they have to shut it down anyway, So
certainly. Yeah, certainly that part makes sense. So, what happens to Frank ultimately? I mean, his story, to me, it seems like it's still kind of cloaked in mystery, but I don't know if that's how you feel about it as well.
okay, well, I could take it back 6 weeks before the fatal incident occurred. In around about November 79, Michael Hand invited all of the international bankers, their operations managers, to come to Australia for a big conference. This conference was held in King's Cross, the heartland of drugs and sex in
Hmm.
Sydney. A very unusual situation. Anyway, the conference went on for a couple of days, and they all talked about how they were going to continue their illegal operations and how to get away with it. But Frank Nugan by now was very worried about this. Frank was getting up and saying they have to get out of illegal operations and stick to legitimate, customers. At the end of the conference, Michael took Frank into another room, a separate room, and they had a fist fight.
Oh,
And from
wow.
that moment on, the relationship was well and truly over.
Hmm.
6 weeks later, Frank Nugan is found dead in his Mercedes Benz with a shotgun in his hands and a bullet in his brain.
Yeah, what I've read about that, it seems like it was kind of it was found to be suicide, but it seems like a lot of unusual circumstances there. So I'm curious what you personally think about it, Peter. Do you think that it was a staged suicide, or was he truly feel like he was out of options and that was the only path that he could take at that point?
Well, look, I initially felt that it was a setup. It's a relatively easy thing to do. He was on a lonely road. He could have been picked up from his home and taken out to this place with a gun to his head and made it look like
Hmm.
suicide. And there were also no fingerprints on the gun,
Mm. Okay.
which made people more suspicious.
Hmm.
But he had the business card of William Colby in his pocket. That's the former head of the CIA, and a ledger in his briefcase in the car with the names of 19 drug traffickers. So it was like he was trying to send a message. This is what we've done. I'm going to take my own life and I'm going to bust these people
Wow.
who have ruined me, that have threatened me. And I think I come down on that side of things that Frank knew that his time was up. He was probably going to go to jail for his family business problems. He had pride, and he also had a sense of vengeance, and he was going to bring down the whole box and
Mm.
dice. But the investigators believed it originally it might have been murder set up to look like suicide. But there was a Bible also found in his car with several words and passages underlined, which suggested his family was being threatened. To me, this is the other evidence that suggests to me that he'd killed himself to protect his family, in a sense.
Okay. Okay. I see. Yeah. Once he is out of the picture, it certainly makes sense that his family would no longer be in danger because they can't, their deaths wouldn't influence anything in either way
That's right.
at that point. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah. Very understandable. So do you think then that if his intent was to send a message with his death, was that message received? I mean, did it sort of blow the whole Nugan Hand situation wide open and lead to arrests or public outcry, anything like that?
Well, yeah, look, the events were unbelievable. It sparked even more investigations. Firstly, the Corporate Affairs Commission turned up at the bank to find that the staff were shredding documents. The order had gone out. Michael Hand had come back to Australia. He threatened the staff to say that if you don't follow our orders, your wives and children will be cut up, basically shredded as well.
Hmm.
So, the families of the bank managers were threatened, the staff were threatened. They had to destroy all the records. So, a couple of the people were charged who were overseeing the shredding, they were charged, but everybody else got off. Most of the international people involved in the bank just disappeared. They left Australia and returned to their home countries. Some went to Asia and went underground. And Michael Hand also, after he gave some evidence, he also went underground.
Yeah, that's a part of the story that it continues to play out for so many years, and I know that you had a part in that. So, how was he able to disappear while under investigation? There was not like a hold on his, or they didn't confiscate his passport or anything like that. I take it at that point.
Well, interestingly, Michael Hand had become an Australian citizen and he had an Australian passport. And he would have been noticed immediately he tried to leave Australia. So he left his $1 million apartment on Sydney Harbour and he took a room and hid in this, you'd call it almost a boarding house, a flat in a very poor suburb. He hid there for 6 weeks. During that 6 weeks, an American by the name of James Oswald Spencer came to Australia. He was a former CIA operative. He was a mate of Michael's and he was a specialist in photography. So he helped him create a new passport, an American passport with him in disguise. He looked like Clouseau from the Pink Panther movies. He had this moustache and fake wig and a beard as well, and wearing glasses, dark glasses. So the passport photograph looked nothing like Michael Hand. And they departed Sydney on a flight for Fiji, and Hand got away scot free.
Wow. Okay. And this was in 80. So he gets away, and is there like a Interpol red notice on him or a international warrant of any sort at that point? I mean, does he have to stay on the run for the rest of his life?
The Asian investigators, I think it was the Singapore investigators, had a arrest warrant out on him. The Australian authorities were quite slack in a sense. They had some contact via his father in the United States, and they were asking questions about this and that through his father. They realized he'd got back to the United States, and they had no jurisdiction and no help from US authorities. They realized that the US authorities were not going to be handing over Michael Hand,
Hmm.
who was a well-known and revered war hero. So
Right.
they didn't put an arrest warrant out under Interpol, but Interpol were aware that the Asian countries wanted him and others, particularly throughout Asia, the other officers who worked for the bank, they had arrest warrants out on them.
Okay, I see. So, do you think that he was fully aware after making it back to the U.S.? Was he fully aware that he would not be extradited, would not be arrested, or did he continue to live as if he was in serious danger?
He obviously lived as if he was in danger. He wanted nothing to do with the Australian authorities
Hmm.
directly. He gave them information that was basically useless, and he said he blamed Frank Nugan for all the bank's
Hmm.
troubles. And once they got that information, they realised that he was not going to cooperate. And there were a dozen Australian investigations into the Nugan Hand Bank in all sorts of levels, and then they started to dovetail into one major investigation, which was another royal commission, which was a drugs royal
Hmm.
commission. And Michael Hand was not seen directly involved in that. He should have been, but they didn't have enough information to know at that time. It sort of came out later in their investigation that Michael Hand could have helped them, but he was long gone. So he was basically able to get back into American life, and obviously at some point changed his identity.
Okay. Okay, I see. So, did he just build an entirely new life for himself now that he was back in the States after so many years being gone? Did he go into a new type of business, or did he get back to his old ways with CIA or organized crime, anything like that?
Well, our intelligence organization called ASIO, they contacted the FBI and the CIA. The FBI were actually asked to track down a number of people, including Michael Hand. Michael Hand wasn't available, but they interviewed others, and they discovered a number of things about Michael Hand.
Hmm.
They discovered a number of things about Michael Hand, that he got away with a lot of money, essentially, money that was in the Cayman Islands, in a Cayman Islands bank. But they also ASIO discovered that he had been recruited again for a CIA operation to train troops in Honduras who were fighting against the Nicaraguans.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, interesting. I did not realize that about him, although I have interviewed a guest previously on the podcast that was doing the very same thing. So I'm starting to wonder if they, they knew each other, as a matter of fact. I might have to follow up on that after this.
They were obviously Oliver North saga is
Yeah.
well covered. But I was really taken aback when I read this ASIO document that Michael Hand was over there. But that's as much as our intelligence people were able to discover, that he had gone back to work with the CIA. And that basically said to the Australian authorities, okay, this guy's hands off. He's never going to cooperate with us. And the authorities are never going to
Hmm.
cooperate. In fact, I've got access to all the FBI interviews with the Nugan Hand staff, because a number of them ended up back in America, and they're basically totally redacted. Even our Royal Commission, the highest level investigation in Australian legal system, received the same documents, completely redacted. There was no information given by the FBI to the Australian authorities that was of any value whatsoever. So you can see that the American people involved in the bank were protected.
I see. Yeah, it's understandable since they were doing so much work at the behest of that agency, and they were, he was a DSC awardee, as you mentioned before. So at that point, does this case just sort of go cold, at least as far as Hand is concerned?
Yes, except not cold for Australian journalists.
Ah,
Every newspaper was following this case, the investigations, and the big question was on everyone's lips: where is Michael Hand? Can we track him down? And so every journalist, investigative journalist of the era, was hoping for the scoop to find Michael Hand.
I'll bet. I'll bet. And as I know now, as everyone knows now, he was finally tracked down, and you were directly involved in that yourself, weren't you?
Yes, started writing a book in 2012 about the Nugan Hand Bank. I was publishing it in 2015. I came to my final chapter and I thought, well, I better give it a go and see if I can find Michael Hand. I knew he would have kept his first name and possibly his middle name, because if you're a CIA operative and somebody from your past comes along and you've got yourself a new Christian name, it's going to look odd if you're with a friend and they say, "Hi, John," and your name is Michael.
Mm-hmm.
So he obviously would have kept his first name and middle name. I assumed he would also have started a business somewhere. Money was going to probably run out. So I started going through US corporate records state by state, starting with the states where I knew he had a previous connection. New York, he'd lived in New Jersey, he'd been to Arizona and Washington State. For some reason, I don't know why, I tried Idaho and up came a Michael Jon. What made it easier was the fact that the John was spelled Jon as opposed to John. So we had a 10 times more chance of finding a Michael Jon in corporate affairs that could have been Michael Jon Hand. So I came
Mm-hmm.
up with the Michael Jon Fuller. And I had in my documents that I acquired over the years his signature, his birth date, his original social security number. And these all matched Michael Jon Fuller's social security, his signature, and other aspects of his identity. So then I found a photograph of him and was able to match it up with a photograph I have had of him taken 40 years earlier in Sydney. And sure enough, he was Michael Jon Hand, now living as Michael Jon Fuller. And
Wow.
I've subsequently found out why he called himself Fuller, why he changed his name to Fuller. When he was recruited to Special Forces, they took him to Fort Bragg for training. His aircraft landed and they were taken across a field that was called Fuller Field.
Oh, wow.
And that was named after another DSC awardee from World War II, whose name was Fuller. And so I think Michael decided, well, he's another guy with the same award as me. I'm going to take his name.
Wow. Incredible. I cannot imagine how you must have felt when you put that together after so many years and after so many other people had spent so much time looking for him, but they didn't find him. You did. That must have been amazing.
It was, but I didn't even know if he was still alive at this point. I found his corporate records, so I had an address. I knew where his business was located. I hired a private detective to go down there and film him, of course, incognito. We didn't want him to know that he'd been found, so they had to basically, use the surveillance operation to photograph him, to film him, to prove that he was alive. And I gave the story to 60 Minutes Australia, released my book the day after it went to air, and 60 Minutes Australia outed him coming out of a supermarket in Idaho Falls, and his life changed forever.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. I've seen that footage, and it is really astonishing. Did you travel to the United States for that as well, or did you just let 60 Minutes take it from there once you gave them the story?
I let them do it. My objective at that point was to get my book out on the
Mm.
day following it went
Oh,
to
yeah,
air. So I couldn't be in two places at
of course.
once. But it certainly made a splash. It was front page news in Australia, and it was a really fantastic way of, you know, rounding off a story that had basically, this was probably the biggest corporate scandal in Australian history. And at the time, it's hard to imagine now, but back in the 1980s, when it did break, it was a big story in the United States as well. So, everybody was looking to find out what was really behind this bank that had got away with it,
Hmm.
basically. And this
Hmm.
person, who was this guy who got away and why did he get away with it for so long? And basically, Michael Jon Hand was a protected species in the United States.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And I am so glad that you were able to track this story down and did not let go of it. To me, there's a huge payoff in that moment when the 60 Minutes reporter calls his name, his real name, Hand, and he just freezes up for about 1 second on camera. I know you've seen it and I know you can remember it, but it's a tremendous payoff because you can tell that he knows that they know the truth. And, right after that, your book came out and the story broke and everything. It was really amazing.
That's right. He had a business, and there were 6 weeks after 60 Minutes turned up with the cameras before it went to air. And in that intervening period, he signed off his business to his workers, and he went underground, essentially,
Really?
again.
Oh, wow. Okay. So after all of this attention, was he arrested by anyone? Was he indicted by anyone? Or was this it's a fascinating story, but did it still have legal ramifications for him after so much time?
No, it didn't have legal ramifications for him. Again, he was a protected species
Yeah.
in the United States. In Australia, the federal police asked for what I had on him. I met a federal policeman in a dark alley, handed over what I'd found, and they did an investigation. A year later, they came back and said, "Look, we don't have an arrest warrant out against him. The only law that he broke at the time was to leave Australia on a false passport, and there was a time limit on that infringement. And basically, they had no reason to open up a new investigation and no reason to arrest him
I see.
or request an arrest."
Yeah. Wow. He really did, in a very real, tangible sense, get away with everything that he was doing because he was doing it for, I guess, what you could call the right people that whole time.
That's right, yeah. But certainly, the last few years of his life, he died in 1980. The last years of his life were probably not planned, weren't part of his plan.
Yeah, he looked like he was in poor health in that video already. I know he has like a neck brace on or something like that. I don't know if that's from an accident or whatever, but he just lived for a few years after 2015 then?
Yes, another 5 years.
5 years? Okay.
I believe, having read some online material from his former company, that he was still a visitor to his old business and possibly was still the proxy owner of that business. My ambition was not to destroy his life or anything like that. It was just to get to the truth and to be able to, I guess, round off a story that basically it was our biggest corporate scandal and put an end to it, basically put a full stop to the story and just say, well, this is what happened.
Well, you certainly accomplished that. So hats off to you. No question about it.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. And, with this podcast, we cover a lot of stories in a related field, nothing quite like this, of course, but many, many, many of them end up with a lot of unanswered questions, as you can probably well imagine. So I am curious, Peter, do you still have some unanswered questions about this one? Any major things that you think still deserve some scrutiny or that you're hoping to come to light in some way, shape, or form at some point?
So happens I'm still working on this case because I am now, of course, you've mentioned my book, which came out in 2015. Recently, I released a podcast series, a 4-part podcast series, which adds more dimensions to the story from an insider who gave me extraordinary interviews. I went over to America and interviewed a wartime friend of Michael Hand's, who worked for the bank doing illegal operations throughout Southeast Asia. And he gave me an incredible interview. And now I'm working on a film project now in editing. And hopefully that will come out in the next year or so.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I was not aware of the film, but I have read the book and listened to the podcast. The name of your interviewee, it's escaping me at the moment, but honestly, he was fantastic. I have to admit, he gave some tremendous insight and he had just a great way of speaking about it. Very, very plain spoken, covert warrior guy. He's a fascinating guy for sure. And I was very, very glad that you were able to get him to speak on the record about all of this.
Yeah, his name is Doug Sapper. He was just a brilliant. He was an associate of Hunter S. Thompson. And Hunter S. Thompson, in one of his books, thanks Doug Sapper. Doug was a medic also in Special Forces, and he helped Hunter S. Thompson out for a very delicate problem of hit that he had during his time in Southeast Asia. And he is virtually a clone of Hunter S. Thompson. His brain works in the same way as Hunter S. Thompson.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Absolutely
Yeah.
brilliant.
What a catch for your part then. That's great. So your film, you're hoping it will be out in the next year or so. I know that, Peter, the book and the podcast, for those of you who want to read more or listen more about this story, are both called Merchants of Menace. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Merchants of Menace, the true story of the Nugan Hand Bank scandal.
Fantastic. Yeah, the book is very fascinating, and the 4-part podcast series. I know that you guys like podcasts, of course, so you can check out that one. It's really really interesting and goes into more depth than we have here, of course, in a single episode. So highly recommend the stuff there. Peter, do you have any other projects, or is this upcoming film your sole focus at the moment?
Yeah, the film Merchants of Menace is a massive enterprise. It's going to take some time to complete it, some money to raise, but look out for it. It will be available internationally, and hopefully your listeners will be able to catch it on screen somewhere.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Is this a strict documentary, or is it like a docudrama, or what exactly? Is there? I mean, I know you probably can't talk too much about it before it's a finished product, but any insight you can share would be appreciated.
Well, certainly a documentary. It will have dramatization because there's no footage of Michael Hand and Frank Nugan
Mm.
in operation. There's lots of news footage. There's newspapers. So it blends some drama that it's based on stories that we've been told, recollections of the interviewees, and it deals with the investigations. Also, Doug Sapper, the gentleman we were
Hmm.
just talking about, features throughout this. He's basically the main narrator, if you
Oh
like,
wow.
of this story. So it's a story about what happened inside the bank. It's a global story. We will have footage from around the world. We'll go into it goes into great depth about the personalities, what drives people, how the investigators were stymieing every way they turned these. It was probably the most incredible investigation for a lot of these people. They really wanted to get it off their chest how the Nugan Hand Bank basically fooled everybody and how Michael Hand got away with it.
Hmm. Yeah, it really is an amazing story. And Doug is, in my opinion, certainly the perfect choice to act as the narrator for this, because I mean, he's just perfect, honestly. So, not to be missed, the podcast, everyone, and we'll look forward to the film. And it's going to be called Merchants of Menace as well. Is that your working title at the moment, Peter?
That's right.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Yeah, keep me in the loop, please. And speaking of that, is there a place that people can connect with you online if they want to follow up on the progress for the film?
Yes, you can go to blackwattlefilms.com.au, which is my website. It has links to my other films, my books as well, also to the podcast.
Okay, fantastic. blackwattlefilms.com.au. We will link that up in the show notes as well for anybody to find it. Peter, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I am definitely looking forward to the movie. So let's stay in touch after this.
My pleasure.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer: this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.